제가 내려지는 내려지는 준비가 필요 없고 부장을 내가 뭐좀 한 다음에
And it's disheartening because you're supposed to be flexible. And now we're kind of like, no, you want to come. You want to have this argument. And I'm even worried about others.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up? Okay. Thank you so much for coming here this afternoon. My name is Sophie. I'm the Executive Director of KACL. Welcome to our 9th annual Young Leader Symposium. Our theme this year is Going Against the Grain. And we've brought in 3 really amazing speakers to share their experiences with you all, how they've pursued their passions to make differences in their communities. Right now, I'm going to call up our KACL President, Yeung, to deliver some opening remarks. I'm very short, so I bring my voice. So whichever I go to event, and I try to bring my stool. One time that I was standing, and I only have my face, and I will get the picture. So, good afternoon. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the 9th Young Leaders Symposium. And on behalf of KACL, board members and officers, we are delighted to held on live, right? We have live stream going and in-person event this year. So KACL always spend much time on what YLS film can be. And it is not exaggerating that we actually usually start right after the YLS event because it is very crucial. So while discussing the theme for this year, and Sophie, our executive director, expressed that, yeah, I want to have something new, something different. And she said, I propose that the theme is Against the Grain. English is my second language, so I did not comprehend fully. So I asked her, so this is a Juhn meeting. So what does that mean? And she said, she used her gesture. She said, look at the grain. It's the same. And the one is out of the line. So I said, Sophie, it means that out of the box thinking. And our officers looked puzzled. And then they said, it is not quite yet, but almost. So the meeting went on because I had somewhat about 80-90% understanding, right? So after the meeting, I tried to comprehend the meaning fully. And this is what I came up with. We tend to seek the comfort zone because it makes us feel right, secure, and complacent. However, we have to pay some consequences. What is that? We have to do the same thing over and over and again. And nothing is profound and amazing and unique. So I am not really saying that the sameness is wrong. No, I think we need to recharge and regenerate our energy so we can do next thing. So I am going to share my thoughts. So I think there are 2 groups in lifestyle. So I'm talking about fish story today. And the first one is tuna character. The second is the lobster character. So I believe, if I'm wrong, please let me know after the meeting. But tuna, as soon as born, they have to use their fin in order to survive. So that makes the fish, tuna, go to farther and deeper and wider world. Of course, they meet with a lot of mishaps and new challenges. But when you see the grown tuna, they're almost 5 feet and 100 pounds and all muscle. Very beautiful. The lobster is a little bit different way. They are in the cage. They don't need to move. They move with the waves. And then food is there. So I think I'm not talking about which is right or which is wrong. I think we need the balance. I'm just talking about the people's preference. But I think leadership requires something new, something different, and something unique. In that sense, the tuna character presents leaders' character more suitable. What do you think? Do you agree? I will say, I will take it as yes. So leaders propel, I think leaders propel them to get out of the comfort zone. With strong character commitment, the ability to integrate, keep the dignity, but most of all, determined to have the legacy. The legacy is for others, not for own profit. And leaders take courage to make the difference with wider, the further region with lots of challenges, failures, conquering the fear and determining to listen to the inner voice. So against the grain character aims to make the world better, not just for own individual success. And first, the privileges. So I'm sure you already know about our speakers. Splendid, stellar speakers. Mr. Joseph Juhn, City Council Thu Nguyen, and Dr. Kee Park. And we are so honored to have you today. Thank you. Lastly, I want to thank Korean Consul General Ki-jun, President of Korean American Society of Massachusetts, Yeung, and Chairman Jang In-soo, and Boston Life editor Park Jin-young, and Boston Korea editor Jang Myung-soo, and he just received the Korean President Award. So, congratulations. And of course, our board of directors and good-looking, very capable officers. So now we are going to have memorable time together. Thank you.
Thank you, President Yeung. I now have the pleasure of welcoming up Ki-jun, who is the Consul General of the Republic of Korea, to deliver some congratulatory remarks.
Good afternoon. I shall be very brief.
Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and privilege for me to have the chance to offer a few reflections today. I'm truly delighted to be a part of this 9th annual Young Leaders Symposium. My heartfelt thanks go to the Korean American Citizens League of New England for arranging this meaningful occasion. It is thanks to all their hard work and efforts this event today has proved possible, even in the midst of the difficulties of COVID-19 pandemic. The Citizens League was established on the 18th of August 1990. It came into being with the aim of providing a clear political voice within the Korean American community of New England. And since its inception, the Citizens League has indeed played a real bridging role between the Korean American community and mainstream American society. It has strived to boost the participation of Korean Americans in politics, and indeed, its guideline has been the lofty goal of building a renewed sense of determination into the future generation of Korean Americans to really play a part in society with all their hearts. We have been recently witnessed a significant increase in the political visibility of the Korean American community at a federal level. We have 4 Korean American representatives who are fulfilling a meaningful bridging role between Korea and the United States. There is still a long way to go, but I trust these achievements will lay solid groundwork for more thriving Korean American representation in American politics. In tandem with the political internship, this Young Leaders Symposium has served as a source of encouragement to young generations. When compared with the political intern scholarship program, which dates back to the late 1990s, this symposium is a relatively new project for the Citizens League, but it is equally important in that it plays a crucial part in prompting young Korean Americans and other communities to really integrate themselves into mainstream society. It is a distinct pleasure to be able to join in motivating young Korean Americans here today and giving them just that little bit more of an impetus to urge them to really fulfill their potential. I'm confident that the panelists today will sow seeds, planting new ideas for them as they really dream big dreams for their future. We should build a future that fully harnesses the energy and promise of young generations, a future we can all embrace. The American poet and educator Longfellow once said, quote, "Youth comes but once in a lifetime," unquote. Young leaders, the future is yours. Go get it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Consul Yeung. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. Around 3 p.m. we will be holding a Q&A panel with our speakers. There should be notepads on your table, so feel free to jot questions down throughout the program. We'll be around 3 p.m. to collect your questions to ask our speakers. Additionally, we are holding a raffle today for Amazon gift cards. You can see our program director, Christine Lee, who's sitting right up here to purchase tickets. There's a QR code on all of your tables that you can scan to donate through PayPal, and the tickets are $2, $2 each. Got that right? Okay, great. So now I have the pleasure of welcoming up our very first speaker, Joseph Juhn. who is a lawyer turned documentary filmmaker and director of 2 films, Geronimo and Chosen. And Joseph, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be speaking alongside Thu and Kee, and I'm glad I'm the first one to go because it'll be probably least engaging, but I'll try my best. Thanks, Mia, for inviting me, and Sophie for arranging things in between. Yeah, I just took a big power nap. I arrived early this morning from New York City. I have a flight to Korea next Tuesday, and I'm editing my second film as we speak, finalizing the rough cut. So my sleeping schedule has completely changed, so I might be a little delirious as I speak, but please bear with me. But that said, I'm gonna try to make this as interesting as possible. So in short, if there's one thing you guys remember from my humble presentation, it's the word diaspora. And I have a presentation file to elaborate on the concept, so let's start. You can go to, and I dare title my presentation "Diaspora is the Future." Would you want to go to the second slide, please? And can you play the video there, please?
I got it.
Got the volume.
Yeah, the volume's good. No, it's having some volume issues. Maybe some volume issues in a second.
Yeah, I didn't coordinate properly before, so if the sound doesn't work, then it's not a problem.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, we did turn down the Spotify.
Oops, that's why.
Can you turn that
Yeah,
down?
just gonna
No. Technical difficulties.
Yeah. No, it's totally my fault. I brought the USB stick at the last minute.
It's all good. Should be good now.
Let's give it a try. Hi, my name is Juhn. I'm a New York attorney, currently producing and directing a film called Geronimo. A year ago, I went to Cuba on a whim to explore the country before American tourists and capitalism poured in, and of course, wanting to enjoy the beach, drinking rum, and smoking cigars. But the lady who came to pick me up at the airport from a hostel I booked several days ago just happens to be fourth-generation Korean Cuban, whose father was the legendary Geronimo Lin, Yeung in Korean. That's where everything started. Although Geronimo passed away in 2006, I got to meet Geronimo's wife, daughter, son, and other family members who told me about the incredible journey Geronimo and his family had to go through in the past 100 years in Cuba. For instance, Geronimo went to law school with Fidel Castro, participated in the Cuban Revolution, and later worked with Che Guevara as the top government official in the new Cuban government. Equally amazing is Geronimo's father, Kim Chang-tek, who took the initiative to collect funds from his friends in Mexico and Cuba in the 1930s and 40s to support Korea's independence movement against Japanese invasion in force. For this effort, his name appears in Kim Woo's autobiography, Filmmaker. So it was a kind of experience that really impacted my worldview, and because I was so convinced that their story has power to move us all, whether you're a Korean living in Korea, America, or anywhere else, or anyone that can humanize and identify with the immigration experience. So I decided to make the documentary about Geronimo and other unsung heroes in Cuba. And with your help, I am committed to sharing the important legacy of Geronimo Lin. Thank you. That's the video I filmed 5 years ago before I started my whole video project.
And as you can see, I got much older in that 4 years. So came Heronimo, right? It opened in theaters in Korea in 2019, I think of 2019. Actually, yeah, exactly 2 years ago today. And so, yeah, in a nutshell, I was a practicing attorney in New York City. I went to Cuba for backpacking. My taxi driver was Korean Cuban. I got interested in their story, started following their footsteps for the next 3 years. Gave up my legal practice. Temporarily, I thought at the time, but I'm still making films until this point. My parents were initially very concerned, obviously, but now I think they're content that I'm continuing to making these movies that are somewhat meaningful. So next slide, please. And I put this out of fun. The numbers next to star indicates the audience score. I'm just saying. You know. But Heronimo is available on Amazon Prime if you want to watch it. I'm gonna be doing a little bit of self-promotion throughout the day today. But that's not for me, but for the film and the creation. Next slide, please. So going back to a more serious note, diaspora. Next slide, please. So, you know, the dictionary definition, right? I'm sure many of us grew up in like Korean American churches, right? The first time you probably came across this concept was through church, right? The Jewish diaspora is often referred to as the origin of the concept. And so is Greek diaspora, Armenian diaspora, there are many diasporas. So it doesn't refer only to the Jewish dispersion, but you know, people of all ethnic groups who live outside of their homeland. So us, right? We're Korean diasporas. Next slide. So earlier this year, there was an online Zoom conference hosted by Koreans living in Central Asia, Russia. And one of the very notable scholars asked this question. He's a third generation Korean Uzbek, and he started off his presentation with this question. Right? He said, would Korean diaspora eventually disappear? And by that he meant, would we cease to exist after generations of living outside of our homeland? Okay. And he didn't give an answer to his own question, right? So during Q&A, I raised my hand on Zoom and asked him, hey, do you happen to think we'll eventually disappear as a result of, you know, our tenuous nexus to our homeland, right? Because we will start to lose language, we'll start to lose our culture, right? Perhaps food becomes more westernized, Americanized, whatever. And he said, we might eventually disappear, right? That was his answer. Somewhat gloomy, yet he had a glimpse of hope. And he said, you know, today having a conference like this among Korean Russians is perhaps a testament that we might not disappear, right? And it got me thinking a lot, right? What does it mean to live outside our homeland and try to find our own identity? Right? So next presentation. So my presentation over the next 20 minutes or so will be my own personal journey to finding my own identity. And I found great sense of comfort in the concept of diaspora. So me, I was born in Minneapolis, and I went to Korea when I was 4 and I grew up there until I was 18. And that's when I came back for end of high school and college and law school. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Korean identity first. Right? So when I went to kindergarten, elementary, middle school, part of high school in Korea, I never ran into a non-Korean student, not only in my class, but in my entire school. Right? I've never really ran into a foreigner, non-ethnic Korean. And I think I'm the generation, probably the last generation that read textbooks in Korean where, it was stipulating basically that, we're proud to be of one ethnic family or something to that effect, right? We're the descendants of Tan, and we're the most homogenous country, and we're proud of that. I mean, it's very nationalistic, ethnocentric. And so, you know, I became curious. I mean, are we really that ethnically diverse, right? Don't. So I hope you guys didn't see, but if you did, then just stay quiet. I was gonna have a quiz for you, which is I did Wikipedia search and try to look for the list of the most diverse countries in the world, right? So number 1 is the most ethnically, culturally most diverse. Numbers 157, I think, is the least ethnically diverse. And South Korea ranked where, roughly? Bottom 2, right, second to the last. And there's one country that's even beyond further below, which was North Korea. Yes. So what does that mean? It wasn't a coincidence that I never ran into non-ethnic Korean during my entire teenage years in school settings, right? What does that mean? Next slide, please. It means, ironically, if you live in Korea as Korean, you never question your Korean identity, right? It's as simple as that. You don't have a consciousness of what it means to be Korean in Korea because everyone around you, you're surrounded by people who look like you, most likely think like you, wear similar stuff. There's no awareness because identity is subjective concept, right? But things got really interesting. Next slide, please. When I came back to the States at age 18, because all of a sudden, I went from being a member of majority to a member of minority, right? And this was a pretty transformative moment in my life because, you know, living in Korea as Korean, you never face biases based on your race or ethnicity, right? Because you're part of the majority, right? But here, it wasn't, right? I had to fight against whatever stereotypes that's, you know, given to me as by virtue of being a member of Asian American or of being a Korean American, right? So I started to try to find myself between the two worlds. I mean, I'm sure, you know, all of you guys, maybe most of you guys go through this. But the way I was envisioning myself, my placement in the world was between two countries, right? It was a national concept. I was like, am I byproduct of Korea? Am I byproduct of America? Right? And as the struggle went on, I learned about this event. Next slide, please. The LA riots in 1992. And I'm sure you guys are familiar, you guys probably learn about it in textbooks or in conferences like this, but I'm gonna have some videos playing just for like a quick nutshell history lesson. So 1991, March 3rd. A relatively young African American by the name of Rodney King was pulled over on highway, and around 16 cops started beating him.
15-year-old Natasha Harlan
Only 2 weeks later,
killed by store owner Thu Nguyen. Thu claimed Harlan was stealing a bottle of orange juice when she confronted the teenager. The store security cameras captured the incident on videotape as Harlan repeatedly hits Thu, who takes a gun from under the counter. Thu claims she accidentally pulled the trigger, killing the teenager. Members of the Black community charged the shooting was racially motivated.
Can you stop the video?
Let's start rolling some.
Yeah, so Rodney King happened. And does it remind you of any recent events that we've all gone through last year? Right? George Floyd, and many other incidents. But in 1991, we didn't have cell phones, right? Nor social media. So it was extremely rare for us to see live injustice happening before our eyes. But one of the residents who was witnessing the whole thing, pulled out his video camera and started filming. And he sent the footage to major media networks the next day. So obviously the event blew up, right? A lot of ethnic communities, especially Black Americans, rose up in anger and said, demanded justice, police brutality, right? Systemic injustice, racism, and all that, everything that we're still shouting these days. So initially, the conversation took off rather, constructively, right? Everyone recognized the clear injustice, and there was a discourse that was headed the right way. But what happened, as you saw on the second video, Latasha Harlan's case, in less than 2 weeks since Rodney King, Latasha Harlan is a Black teenager girl, walked into a Korean-owned store in South Central LA, and they got into scuffling because a Korean merchant accused the teenager of stealing a bottle of orange juice, right? And they got into scuffling, and then she ended up being shot by the Korean owner. I mean, there's no justification or excuse for what's happened there. But something interesting happened, and the argument that I'm about to make is not my own, but by a lot of Korean American activists and scholars who've studied these two cases, which eventually led to the LA riots, is that US media started focusing on the Korean Black tension and started amplifying the tension that existed within the Black Korean communities, thereby almost taking our attention away from the essence of racial injustice in the US and Rodney King, right? So, for instance, Latasha Harlan's video footage was playing in loop over and over the next several weeks on major US media, right? And LA Times and whatnot started reporting a series of incidents that happened between the Black and Korean communities, right? So with that in mind, let's just watch what happens next during the LA riots.
For the videotape, we were in an area right outside of Koreatown. There are a lot of Korean businesses in that area, and here we go. Once again, we got there just as this market was starting to be loaded. Look at these people pouring out of the shoe store. You gotta wonder what's going on in these people's minds. You wonder what's going on inside these stores. Well, we took some shots here. They don't care, but I'll tell you what happened moments later. The Korean merchants and store owners who own that shopping complex, 3 of them were holding guns, and they just started firing. They actually pulled out loaded guns, but they're both flying all over.
That's the only answer I give you. You have to define your destiny in your own way. When you had a $30 demonstration in America, it's the largest fucking demonstration in America. They're carried out by your parents who doesn't in a fucking year. And you guys presented it. That's when I have to be more like it. I give a free American.
That's intense. K.W. Lee is a legendary Korean American journalist. And it's funny because it's 2005. I was filming him as a film student back in undergrad. And I was sitting in a seats like this, listening to him speak on the podium. And the moment he said, I became Korean American after the LA riots, I felt like learning of that event and the kind of passion that he conveyed to us, So as young college students, I felt like I became Korean American that day. And it was very profound, right? Because as I was saying earlier, that I was trying to find myself between the two worlds where learning about the LA riots truly made me an ethnic Korean American as a minority here living in the US, right? LA riots, for 72 hours, no police came to Koreans' rescue. Over 2,500 Korean stores were burned down. All the police force during the whole riots were protecting Beverly Hills or Westwood, which is wealthier neighborhoods, and saw from distance how as Koreatown was burning down to ashes, right? So, and this is really related to the current project that I'm working on now, which I'll talk about a little later, but let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So, another one, let's go to the next slide. So, you know, two things changed at large, right? One was our internal racism, right? Koreans, this is a little touchy subject matter, right? I mean, we saw the demons within ourselves during the LA riots, how we have our own biases against other ethnic groups. And so we realized, okay, we were mistreating our non-ethnic employees in our stores and things of that nature. So we realized we have to be a responsible American citizen. Right? Two was we didn't have any elected political officers in the entire country in 1992. Consul General mentioned 4 US congressmen, which is a documentary I'm making right now. But at the time, 1992, we didn't have anyone elected at any level of government. So there was no one to represent our voice, right? We became victim vulnerably to whatever they were reporting on the media. No one was able to step up to the plate and speak on our behalf. So one more slide, please. So KWE says, before LA riots, we were Korean immigrants, but after we became Korean American. So I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but it's also not my own words, but some of the Korean American scholars, they said this for Korean Americans was what internment experience was for Japanese Americans. Yeah. So 28 years later, it's actually 29 years later, how much have we come, right? We see George Floyd, we see anti-Asian attacks, like it's a whole generation ago, right? But it's a deja vu almost. We're experiencing the same thing. So I feel like it is almost our generation's LA riots, what we're witnessing these days. So next slide. So this was in KACL-NE, Korean American Students Conference. I don't know, Key, if you went to one of these conferences when you were younger.
Well, the parties.
The party part came after the serious part. But yeah, I was at UC San Diego, my college. And we led KACL-NE in my senior year. So it was a big deal back in the day. It's really unfortunate that it doesn't happen to continue anymore. But this is where I learned about the whole LA riots, North Korean human rights, US-KR, Korea relations, and so forth. So yeah, I thought I was Korean American. Now I found my role and my mission. But something else happened. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. I learned of a concept and identity that's even larger than Korean American identity. And so let's go to the next slide. So I went to China as my first job, and I went to specifically Yeung, which is where a lot of Korean ethnic Chinese people live, right? Joseonjok. Next slide. I became good friends with one of Joseonjok friends, Korean ethnic Chinese friends. His name was Il-soo. One day Il-soo pulled me and he said, "Hey, Joseph, I feel like Joseonjok, the Korean ethnic Chinese people, we compare ourselves to apple pear, right?" And I'm like, "What's the apple pear?" And he says, "It's a hybrid fruit. that's only produced in northeastern Chinese region, in Yangon region. And he said, we compare ourselves to apple pear because we're neither fully apple nor fully pear. We're neither fully Korean nor fully Chinese, right? When he said that, I was in shock because I never thought other types of Koreans outside of Korea would also face this dual hybrid identity issue, right? I thought it's something only I and my Korean American peers experienced. And it elevated my understanding of this whole concept of identity, right? Next slide. I worked at what's called Liberty, North Korea back in undergrad. And as a result, I got to meet a lot of North Korean defectors living in China and Korea and elsewhere, South Korea. And they told me very similar things, right? They were born and raised in North Korea, but now they reside in South Korea. They said, I'm not sure if I am fully South Korean or North Korean, like this in-betweenness. Next slide. When I was backpacking across Germany, I ran into Korean Germans, and one of the guys told me, hey, like we have an annual party of Korean Germans, and would you like to come? So I went, and I realized that there's over 50,000 Korean Germans as a result of a lot of Korean miners and nurses being sent to Germany in exchange for foreign aid during the 70s and 80s in Korea, 60s. And their offsprings, right? Second, third generation Korean Germans. They told me the same thing. They said, hey, I'm part Korean, part German. I don't feel like I fully belong to either society. Next slide. When I was in law school, I interned in Brazil, and I also got plugged into the Korean Brazilian community. And there's also over 50,000 Korean Brazilians, right? Although Brazil is racially much more diverse and probably less, arguably less racial discrimination, they also feel it similarly, right? Probably to a different degree, but still. Next. I even went to South Africa, where I ran into Koreans there, and they told me the same thing. Hey, I'm African, I'm Korean. I'll still try to find myself in between these two worlds. Next. In Korean, Russian. I mean, the list goes on, right? Next. And one by one, I realized, wow, there's a world way bigger than just Korea and America. Right? There's, next slide. Next slide. And, you know, just naturally meeting friends from all over the world. And two, there's a lot of Vietnamese diaspora as well around the world, right? And it really elevated my understanding of self, right? It's an expansion of my worldview. It's an expansion of those who can come into my world, right, as a result of thinking diasporically. So there are over 8 million Koreans outside of Korea, right? Which is an astounding number. For those of you who are from Korea, if you add the second, third, fourth largest cities in Korea after, so not Seoul, but Daejeon, Daegu, Busan, it's still less than 8 million. It's about 7 million, right? So it's a bulk of population. Next slide. So what kind of relationship should there exist between the diasporas and homeland? I mean, have you guys thought about it, right? What kind of relationship should there be between the diasporas and homeland? Next question, next slide. I get a lot of inspirations, and I'm almost done in probably 3 to 5 minutes. I get a lot of inspirations from a theologian, philosopher by the name of Nam-sun Kang. And she wrote a book called Diasporic Theology, and in which she says, you know, diasporic thinking, diasporic identity, diasporic consciousness implies that one is skeptical, that one is critical of what is, and tries to desire for something more, right? And it's because of your upbringing. It's because you're born and raised in two different worlds that allows you to be a critical thinker, right? So diasporic identity is not just a noun to refer to those who live outside of their homeland, but it can actually be a verb, right? Because of your two or more worlds, you have the ability to think more critically of where you are, and you can hope for something more, is what she's arguing. And that really enlightened me. That even expanded my understanding of diaspora. So next. So I have one question and a few more slides before I end. And I think Kee, as he will be speaking later, I think this is a key question for us to ask too. What does our double mode of seeing, double identity, more multi-identity, do for our homeland? I think because as a result of us living away from the Korean Peninsula, South Korea, and being too knowledgeable of the politics, the infight, and the ideological conflict that exists within South Korea, as a result of that, I think our understanding of homeland and peace and reunification, and our heart for all Koreans, irrespective of the size, amplifies. And I think that's why I tend to be provocative in Korea by saying that it is in fact the diaspora that can be peacemakers. It is in fact us that can play a role in bringing two Koreas together to create a more peaceful region. Let's go to the next slide. But I have one more sort of proposition, that is, let's not just dwell on diasporic identity and consciousness, but let's just go one more further. So next slide. So if any of you guys watched my film, Heronimo, there's one scene in the film where this is a photo of 1,000 Koreans, part of 1,000 Koreans who were sold as indentured servants to Mexico in 1905. If you look at it, you have little kids on the top left, you have older seniors on top right, you even have someone who's holding a stick with his eyes closed. I think he has maybe visual impairments. But irrespective of their age or abilities, they had to work under scorching sun, 16 hours a day, cutting cactuses, right? And there is one letter that's found by a Chinese merchant who was passing by this region, a letter that he sent home that basically said there are 7 different degrees of slavery in Yucatan during that time. And Koreans were the 7, and the 6 were pigs and cows, right? Meaning Koreans were subhumans. They were treated as if they were not humans. As I was editing this scene, something happened in South Korea that really caught my attention. Next slide. 500 Yemenese refugees arrived in Jeju Island, and they sought asylum. They said, "Hey, we are fleeing from our torn country, civil war and persecution. Please accept us." What soon happened was thousands, tens of hundreds of thousands of Koreans took to the streets and started demonstrating against their arrival and accepting them as asylum seekers. They said, "You guys are fake refugees. You guys go back to your country." Next. These are some of the signs by labor immigrants in Korea saying, "Please don't discriminate us against our race." Next. And he's holding up a sign that says, "I'm not a working machine, I'm a human." Right? Next. And so, on one hand, I was editing a scene to honor Koreans who were sent 100 years ago to work as near slaves, indentured servants. But on the other hand, I was seeing news of people protesting against people who are fleeing their own country because of conflicts and persecution. So I was very torn, right? is it fair that I try to honor people of my ancestors for the hardship that they endure while not speaking out for those who might have come from different regions, seeking better life, right? So I came to conclude that, next slide, if we are diaspora, and if being diasporic members is important, so are they. And I mean, it may sound cliche, but everyone is diaspora, right? And this has a lot to do with my recent revelation of this whole idea around Asian American identity. I'm reading J. Caspian Kang's book, The Loneliest American. And I'm also developing, what it means to be part of, just more than a Korean American, but how do we build solidarity with members of other Asian American communities, right? So in closing, can you start from maybe like 1 minute 30? This is the last video that I have. 1 minute 30? 1 minute.
저 역시 잠깐만 주 대한민국 한반도 평화통일에 큰 기여할 수 있을 거라는 확신이 있습니다. 잠깐 영상을 보실까요? So why don't we start with the idea of diaspora?
So the heart of diaspora is pain. The idea that you can't live in your ancestral homeland, that you can't be where you want to be, and perhaps you can't practice a religion or a culture in the way that you otherwise would. But what results from the pain is innovation. The idea that you can change some of the traditions and adapt them and modernize them and make them relevant wherever you are.
Para mí yo sé coreano, yo no sé cubano. Para mí yo sé coreano. Y me muero siendo coreano. ¿Comprende? Porque la única patria que reconoció mi padre y mi madre.
나한테 한국어 좋지 않아요. 그렇지만 매일 한국어 공부하고 있어요. 한국에 온 사람입니다. 알아요. 그렇지만 난 한국 사람입니다.
Could you read the letter from your grandfather?
La patria. Patria es el legado de abnegación de nuestros antecesores y la ofrenda de nuestros mártires. Es la inspiración de los que sueñan un mañana mejor y un futuro de hermandad. Su concepto va más allá de las fronteras geográficas. No se limita a los que nacen en un lugar determinado, ni se sujeta a las normas políticas de un nacionalismo egoísta. El sentimiento patriótico debe fundirles a la esperanza y al clamor de los desposeídos, de los explotados que aspiran y luchan por un mundo mejor. La patria es la dignidad y el honor de los que saben merecerla.
Next slide. So in closing, as a result of our ancestors, our parents, grandparents' pain, I believe we're the generation of innovation, innovative thinking, double mode of seeing diasporic identity. And there are many things that we could achieve together. I have just 2 more slides. One is I wrote a book in Korean this summer, and it was published. I brought 10 copies. It's for, I think it's on the table outside. So anyone wants to purchase it for relatively cheap, just please come. And next is, as Consul General alluded to, there are 4 Korean Americans elected to US Congress last year. I followed their journey as my second documentary, all 5 of them. And witnessed the history of making of the 4 US congressmen. So I hope to finish that within this year and get it out by early next year. And it's super interesting. I'm obviously biased as a creator, but I hope to be able to come back to you and share this film with you at some point too. So thanks for your undivided attention. I went a little over time, but thank you. I'll talk to you next.
I can't wait for the Q&A session to talk about Joseph's talk. Thank you so much, Joseph. I now have the pleasure of welcoming up Thu Nguyen, who is a proud Vietnamese refugee, auntie, artist, youth worker, and sunset chaser. They recently made history as the first non-binary person to ever be elected in Massachusetts and the first Southeast Asian person elected to Worcester City Council. So Thu, it's all yours.
I think I'm short too.
I'm so glad.
First, I want to thank you all for having me and welcoming me into your space, and thank you, Joseph, for that beautiful speaking portion that you just did, and where my heart was also really pulled to the experiences that I could very similarly relate to. And you know, I made history November 2nd.
Yes.
And
Yay.
Thank you. Thank you. And quite honestly, it's a little bit the last thing that is on my mind, because I think we all make history together. And so before I do my speaking portion, I kind of just want to intentionally ground everyone, and so that we could bring each other in holistically into this space. So if you could just bear with me, I'm going to lead us in a meditation. And if you're not used to it, don't worry, there's no expectations. So if you feel comfortable, if you could just close your eyes or pick a spot in the room that feels safe for you. Hopefully not someone's face, because that could be a little bit awkward. But I just want you to breathe. Breathe as you normally do. You know your body best. And just lay your feet on the ground and feel it just sinking into the earth. Feel your shoulders just loosening up. And I want you to feel the rhythm of your heartbeat to stretch and wiggle, and let all that you carry release and disperse into the air. I want you to breathe into this earth around us. We are on indigenous land, a land nurtured and tended to by Black and Brown communities, by people of color, by our lineages, and those who come before us. And I want us to take the time to really honor them, those who came before us. We are birthed from resilient ancestors, communities, families, whether blood or chosen, and friends who sacrifice days on end to make sure we are okay. We are the compilation of atoms, the elements, water, air, fire, and earth, alchemized, joined in love to create our existence here. Most of us would not be here if we weren't precious, if we didn't fight for our first grasp of air. And I want you to imagine a time when you felt safe. And this could be a week ago, it could have been when you were a child. And I want you to feel into that safety. Where were you? Who was there? What did it feel like? What was the scent, the taste? What is the vision of safety? And I want you to breathe that in and imagine it as a color. Absorb it and feel it at the center of your body. I want you to breathe it, absorb it, take it in. So when you feel like you've taken enough safety for yourself, I want you to send it to the person next to you, into this room, a room where we could actually be safe together. And then I want you to send it to your loved ones, the ones who might not physically be here. Send it to the world around us, to the people who are deeply in need of safety. Because in this world, when we feel safe, we are able to exist in our full potential and our dreams. What are your hopes? And what are your dreams? I want you to envision your future, a universe of your own creation. What is that world? What can you create with just your heart? I just want you to take a few seconds to live in that sacred space of you, and come back to us when you're ready. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me in that. Welcome back. So I'm Thu Nguyen. I'm a youth worker. I'm a community organizer. And as mentioned, I'm a Vietnamese refugee who just got elected into Worcester City Council, which makes me the first Southeast Asian city councilor there, as well as the first non-binary person to be elected in Massachusetts. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I just want to share a little bit about how I came to be, because I think the story of us and our lineages is very important when we think about our future and what we pass on to our descendants. I came to the United States when I was just 1 year old. My dad fought in the Southeast Asian War as part of the Southern Vietnamese Army. And after the fall of Saigon, he was actually in prison for 6 years. And we came here in '93. And one of my first memories in the United States was, I remember my siblings and I, after going to school and stuff, we would be hanging outside, right, as any young person would. But we actually would pick up cans. We picked up cans, and it was like a game to us. Who could collect the most cans? What brands can we get? Is yours 5 cents or is it 15 cents? And it was really fun, and I didn't really think about it until later on that it was for survival. That 5 cents, that 10 cents was actually to help my family live. We were living in poverty, 7 of us in a 3-bedroom apartment. My family, my parents working in factories at that time. My dad came here with just $100 in his pockets, which in many ways is a privilege. Some people just leave without anything, just the clothes on their backs, right? And I meditate on this, and I think about the ways in which we still find joy and happiness and fun in the resiliency of our lives. Sometimes people look at immigrants and refugees, and they're looking at us from a deficit model. And I look at my parents, and I look at all of us here, and I see beauty. I see healing. I see the ways in which we can create something else in our world. And so last year in 2020, the pandemic happened, and we found ourselves in a lockdown. And there was also a rise of anti-Asian hate throughout our whole entire nation and over the globe, as mentioned. And my first thought and heartbreak was thinking about my parents, who survived war, who left their homeland to come here, who struggled through poverty. And I was just so worried that they would be re-traumatized to live in the same conditions as before. They escaped Vietnam to be safe, right? And here they are, finding themselves in very similar crises. And so I was heartbroken, and I was so nervous for them. I was nervous for them more than myself. And then what I realized instead was that they were already prepared for moments like this. They spent their whole lives, hoarding things and trying to, stretch $1, eating rice and soy sauce. That was how they actually got me here to where I am. And then all of a sudden, I had this moment where I just felt so blessed, for their love and their kindness and their sacrifice. I know oftentimes refugees and immigrants hold this indebtedness to our parents, right, for sacrificing themselves to leave a place they love, leave their elders behind to come here. And 2020 was when it really hit me how deep. Not only did they sacrifice that, but they built me up so that I could give back to my community. I couldn't even comprehend how amazing that was in this unspoken way. They never asked more of me than to be successful and to be a good person. And that for me made me think about, really, if my parents provided me the space to grow, how can I support? How can I really support people in need right now? And so I was thinking at the time of the shutdown, how it really led to a lot of people being unemployed, a lot of mental health crises, and all these things that feel so huge. How can we even tackle any of this, right? And then I just once again paused, and I was seeing all over the nation, mutual aids were popping up. This notion, solidarity, not charity, right? And mutual aids have always happened throughout history, but this was the first time where I saw people come together as they are. Everyone had a role. If you had $5, if you didn't have $5, and you could drive someone to get groceries. You know, it wasn't about, what your title is, how much money you make. It was just that we all have this ability to support each other. And so that made me think a lot. And I started organizing Mutual Aid Worcester, and I created this thing called the Mutual Aid Worcester Fund, and we raised over $75,000 to really support each other. And what was magical to me was I was doing the math. I think I fundraised for the first week as a pilot, and we got $1,000 and too many requests for funds. And so I divided it, and it became $35 each. That was all. That was all we could promise, 100 people, $35. And I remember people being like, why are you just gonna give people money? That's it? They asked me to give people money. And I was like, yes, because people deserve their dignities, right? We don't need people to constantly break down their scars and all that to get help. And people don't get help because of that. And what kind of world is that when we aren't helping each other? When we're too shy, too embarrassed to actually ask for help? And when we can help, we ask them, we dangle it, saying, what are you gonna use it for, right? What would the world look like if we loved freely? And then the other thing I got was, what is $35 gonna do? And I just had to breathe and tell them, as an immigrant and refugee, $35 stretches really far. There are people who sacrifice their food, their daily food, to pay rent. There's single mothers out there who could actually buy diapers instead of leaving their child soiled because they don't have any other option, right? And there's these daily things that sometimes we take for granted. And it's not until someone reminds you that $35 could save a life that people think deeper about money. That money is not just a way for us to have social upward mobility. It's a way for us to alchemize our hearts, to do better for each other. And so I thought that it's not always about the big things that we can do for each other, but the small little things, the $35. And then afterwards, I had a lot of undocumented folks reach out to me. And I wasn't quite sure why, because I am an organizer, but I can't solve everything, right? But it made me think that this group that often is hidden, and they prefer to be underground because that's where they're safe. At a time when they had need, they reached out to me because there was some sense of safety. They were sharing with me that at food banks, they were too scared to go. They had to show their ID. And with that, it broke my heart because everyone deserved food. And there was such a rise in food insecurity that there's a whole population here that starved. They really just starved. And once again, paying rent, right? Instead of buying food, they starved. And so then I created the Immigrants and Refugee Pantry. And for me, that was a way in which we could prioritize them without having them ask for documentations. And it also made me think about the ways in which when we have privilege, when we actually became, for Vietnamese folks in Worcester, we've been here for third, fourth, fifth generations. We accumulated something, right? How do we actually extend ourselves to support others when they have needs as well? Because we've been there. And to be quite honest, there's a lot of Vietnamese people who are still there, but oftentimes we don't talk about it, right? And so for me, I was thinking about how do we do this together? And we uplift each other all at once together. And there's no space and time, because right now, as we were mentioning earlier, COVID taught us that this is a collective issue. And so then summer 2020 happened, and we faced a racial reckoning with the murder of George Floyd and so many other tragic losses. I found myself really heartbroken. I think because I was doing so much organizing at the time, I didn't feel it in my heart how bad things were in my community, because I was just doing and doing. I think other people had time to process, but I was since March lockdown, I was just going. But that summer really broke my heart. It just did something that changed me forever. And I'm not quite sure what it did fully yet. I think that'll be another conversation. But I saw my youth struggling. I saw them also heartbroken, some suicidal, to be quite honest. And that made me feel even more hopeless, except that, I think of myself now as someone who's 30, as someone who had the privilege of going from refugee to college educated to being a director at a nonprofit. What is my duty now? What is my role? How do I help them navigate the system? Because if I was to be stuck in the hopelessness, they will be stuck in the hopelessness. And I thought about those who came before me, and out of hopeless situations, out of life and death situations, they continued, even if it meant sacrifices. And I used to, like I said, I used to hate feeling indebted, and I used to not understand my parents' sacrifices for me. And this was when it clicked, that as someone who accumulated anything, that I have a responsibility for the community. And so I decided to run for city council, and I never really imagined myself running. I've always liked behind the scenes stuff, youth work, organizing. I actually don't even like being a face that is visible, to be quite honest. But I think this is a time that is demanding us to show up in a different way. And I think we all have to take that on together. And so last year, to wrap it up, I remember everyone saying this is an unprecedented time. We don't know what's happening, it's unprecedented. And now I think is the time that we actually set the precedents. What does it look like for our government to holistically care and uplift all of us? What does it look like for all of us to be part of a greater movement? To show up for each other at the capacities that we actually have, to not stretch, but to love. And what does it look like for us to reimagine our world and alchemize our hearts? And so I leave you with those questions as leaders in our community, that we are the ones to co-create our future. And that's a magical gift and a responsibility that we all hold. And I thank you all for carrying that each and every day, that we do this together, and that we leave something for our descendants to be proud of. Thank you.
Thanks, Thu. That was so inspiring. It's time for lunch. So we have a lunch buffet set up at the back of the room. Feel free to, we're gonna break for about 30 minutes. And you can grab your lunches, eat them, and we're gonna come back for our third speaker. Actually, what's the time right now? Okay, so yeah, we'll come back right around 2 p.m. for our third speaker. But enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back in about 30 minutes. Oh, we are still selling raffle tickets. Dr. Kee Park, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Program of Global Surgery and Social Change at Harvard Medical School. He's also the Director of the Korea Health Policy Project at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Park.
Well, thank you, Sophie and Mia, really for putting this symposium together. During the time of pandemic, and to be able to gather like this is really special. And I know a lot of hard work went into it, so especially the officers at KACL. So thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you to Consul General Yeung for sponsoring this, not just this time, but there has been a continuous sponsor for years, as far as I'm aware. I think this is amazing that the South Korean government sees development of Korean American leaders here in the U.S. as something that they want to support. It's really good. Couple of thoughts on the previous speakers. Two, when you campaign for Congress, I'm going to be part of your campaign. Not just Congress, but President too.
I'm an immigrant, I can't.
Oh, and then when you get elected, I want you to start every congressional session with a meditation. We're going to be in really good shape. And then Joe, gosh, your presentation is really, goes deep, right? It's very personal. So I got to tell you something. I knew when you started the Geronimo project, there's a funding gap, and you started a Kickstarter.
Right.
I'm one of your Kickstarter donors. I'm number 98. Okay? And one of the things that you get back as a Kickstarter donor is you get to meet the director and producer in person. So finally, you fulfilled your obligation. So anyway, I think one of the criteria, the theme is going against the grain, right? So this is really the we're the people that didn't follow the formula, so to speak. I think the criteria is that you have to have the best haircuts in the house. Joe and me, I think we have the coolest haircuts. It must have been part of the selection committee's criteria.
Yes.
But anyway, I think it's wonderful. I attended this particular conference maybe 2 or 3 years ago, pre-pandemic. I can tell you the Puniki, the atmosphere is totally different. And I think not that it was bad before, it was really good, but we definitely stepped it up and made it much more engaging, and especially the people they invited. So a little bit about me. So as Sophie mentioned, I work at Harvard Medical School. I'm a member of the faculty there, and I do what we call global surgery. So global health, so I'm a surgeon by training, by the way, I'm a neurosurgeon. But global health has to do with the recognition that there are people in this world that do not enjoy the same level of access to medical care that we here take for granted. For instance, there are people living in many developing countries that when they have a simple head injury, which can be treated quite quickly, they don't have access to that, right? And they either die or become disabled. And that number is staggering. It's 5 billion people, more than half the world population, do not have access to surgical care. So global health has to do with addressing those health inequities. It's really about taking care of the people that do not have access, especially in those living in poor countries. And global surgery has to do with the surgical care component of their health care. So I direct the policy and advocacy pillar within this program. My chairman is a gentleman named Dr. Paul Farmer. You may or may not know who he is, but he's fairly well known actually worldwide as a really a global health giant. And then my previous chairman was Jim Kim. Dr. Jim Kim was the chair of Global Health Department at Harvard Medical School, went to Dartmouth as the president for a short time, and then went to the World Bank to become the first Asian Korean American to head up the World Bank. So with it, what I do as a policy and advocacy director is really cool. I get to work with ministers of health, people at high-level officials, and especially for these developing countries, and talk about why it's important for your country, whichever country we're dealing with, to prioritize investments in surgical care for all people. And we make economic arguments, human rights arguments. But most recently, I was in Berlin for the World Health Summit. This was in October. And the vice president of Ecuador asked for a meeting with us, and we had a bilateral meeting with him. And he said, hey, can your team help our country scale up surgical care for all of our people? I said, absolutely, this is what we do. So I work in this kind of space, and I'm not trying to say that to toot my horn or anything like that. Just wanted to give you an idea of the work that I do, and then I'll go back to how I got there, which is the whole theme of this conference, right? This meeting. Then I also do North Korea related work, and I spend about a third of my time on a lab called Korea Health Policy Project. And because of my work in North Korea, so I've been to North Korea over 20 times, first in 2007. I worked with the Korean American, I directed North Korea program for the Korean American Medical Association. And our counterpart is the Joseon Yohatrepe, right? Korean Medical Association of North Korea. And we work in medical exchange. We do surgeries together, we provide equipment, things like that. But then, because of the pandemic, we aren't able to travel, and so we have a project at Harvard Medical School called Korea Health Project, where we study factors, geopolitical factors actually, that impact the health of North Korean people. For example, we look at things like the impact of international sanctions on the North Korea. It's the most restrictive sanctions ever in history, and there's a humanitarian exemptions process in case you want to provide assistance to North Korea, but requires an application and an approval by a committee within the UN Security Council. All these resolutions state explicitly that these are not intended to harm ordinary people of North Korea or hinder the delivery of humanitarian assistance, but in fact they do. And so one of the projects that I worked on specifically looked at how many ordinary North Korean people we think may have died as a result of these sanctions. And we published this in 2019. Wall Street Journal picked it up. It's 4,000 at a minimum, and most of them are children under 5 years of age. And this is a result of the sanctions that our country, USA, has led to impose on North Korea. So we look at things like sanctions. We look at things like absence of banking channel, which there's no way to transfer money to North Korea for legitimate humanitarian activities. They have to hand carry money, and that actually interferes with humanitarian aid. And then, of course, right now, the sanctions, the COVID-related restrictions, and the need for North Korea to reopen, because all humanitarian actors have left the country. There are no international staff within North Korea. And how do we get them back in there? How do we get vaccines to North Korea? I'll just briefly share with you that North Korea, I think it's reasonable to consider mRNA vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer vaccines to provide to North Korea. There was a perception that North Korea's refrigeration capacities could not handle ultra low temperatures. They're probably right. But we found a way where North Korea could actually store in simple refrigeration facilities for 30 days. And they could deploy these vaccines within that 30-day period. And we have shown that they are able to actually deliver up to 3 million injections a day. They did that during the measles outbreak in 2007. So anyway, those are the kind of things that I do at the Korea Health Policy Project. So how did I get to be doing what I'm doing? So by the way, just a quick aside, on Thursday night, I don't know if you know, but the Vice Foreign Minister of South Korea, Juhn was here and giving a talk at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School. And he recognized me and he said, Dr. Park, I know who you are, I read your writings. So this really is encouraging to me because what it means is that my academic output has direct impact on policymaking, right? So we could make a difference. So how did I get here? And it wasn't because I had a formula or a master design where I said, you know what, when I hit mid-50s, I'm gonna be at Harvard as a professor. That was never on my radar. I came here in the 1970s. My parents, we settled in northern New Jersey. A lot of what my aspirations were defined by what we, and I would say when I say we, my parents considered as success in this country, right? And I would ask the parents here to ask yourselves, what is your conception of success here in the U.S. and how is how are those values being transferred to your children now, and how that impacts their future goals? I would ask you to look at that carefully because what I heard was you need to become a professional, make a lot of money, and I heard that from my parents. I heard that from the Korean community. I actually heard that from the society, American culture overall. So that was reinforced in my thinking. There was never anything that had to do with serving the less fortunate, right? Or going beyond my individual needs. It never was taught that. So I went to medical school, and I have an interesting story. When I was in medical school, I actually left because there was within the Korean community, including my parents, there was this so much emphasis on Harvard. Like, you got to go to Harvard. So I said, you know what, I'm going to apply. And so I got into the graduate program in pharmacology. So I left medical school and I entered into a PhD program at Harvard. Right? And the only reason I did that, I'll be quite honest, is because I could tell people I went to Harvard. Bad reason to go someplace. Bad reason. The end result was I got kicked out. After a year and a half, if you go there just for the name, it's a lot of work, guys. I could not keep up with the studies, and the university asked me to withdraw. They were very kind with me and said, kid, you can't continue here. You should withdraw. It's like, okay, but the reality was I got kicked out. That was in the 80s. So now, here I am. I went back to med school. I went to Rutgers Medical School. I did my neurosurgery residency training in Philadelphia. Met my wife, Susan, she's sitting over there, and we moved to a small town in south of St. Louis called Cape Girardeau. And I went into private practice neurosurgery. That was my goal, just have a comfortable life, be a member of the community, raise a family, white picket fence, all that stuff. So we're in Missouri, and I'm working, we have a couple of kids. And after about 7 or 8 years, I got bored. It was nice, private practice, being a doctor, all that stuff. And there was success, right? I had financial success, professional and prestige and all that kind of stuff. But there was something missing. Right? And there's a famous line, a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. And he said many good things, but this particular time he said, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in service of others. And boom, it hit me. And then there was another saying, it's actually a Bible verse from Luke. And in Luke, it says, to those much has been given, much is expected. And gosh, that was just talking to me. You know, I've been given everything, you know, and then plus more. And that started a journey of introspection and meaning in my life. And it ended up being serving other people. I don't think you can, there's a discussion about empathy, right? Can you teach empathy? I don't know about that. You know, there's debate about that, but you can definitely learn empathy. And I know Joseph's talking about it when he's talking about diaspora and thinking about the Korean people, you know, the identity above Korea, outside and among people living overseas, and what they can do for one another and actually beyond. And what Thu's talking about, you know, the giving, solidarity, not charity, right? Dignity. How do you provide assistance to others while preserving their dignity? That kind of, when you put value on that kind of relationship, that's empathy that I think, when I'm talking to the younger generation here, start looking inward and then the top parts of yourself that really says, wow, that makes sense to me. That's the part you want to cultivate, because to me, that's the origin of caring for other people. And that's, to me, what started my journey to service and ultimately to where I am today. So here's what happened. I left private practice, and for the next decade, I went overseas to help teach neurosurgery in developing countries, places like Ethiopia. And in Cambodia, actually, I took my wife and my whole family over there. That was a bit selfish of me. But we ended up going all together, and we lived there for 3 years. And I was doing work in North Korea at the same time. And 2 observations I made. One is I was really frustrated because I'm teaching neurosurgery to these Cambodian neurosurgeons, and they're bright, they're doing great, and they're teaching as many people as I can. But I realized quickly the problem isn't more neurosurgeons or surgeons. That's only going to impact a little bit. The problem was that health systems, a system level problem, that the governments weren't investing enough money into their public health services in these developing countries. There was a lack of resources. It was politics at the end of the day. And then there was in North Korea, I would go to North Korea, and then these international sanctions were continuing to constrict our ability to do humanitarian work, good work. But there were sanctions here, there were treasury actions, executive orders, travel bans, all these things were happening. So that was one frustration. But the other one was, there were people that were working on North Korea humanitarian issues, and there was almost all non-Koreans. These are Europeans and white Americans. I said, where are the Koreans? This is a Korean problem. Where are the Koreans? This is something that the Koreans should be the first ones to try to fix, but it was being fixed by, or at least addressed by non-Koreans. And I was actually embarrassed about that. So those are the things that I recognized. And I came back to the US in 2016, and I got a master's in public health at Harvard School of Public Health. And there I learned the skills to address the health system problems. And then also looking at these other issues, like how do I become more vocal about these issues that are beyond medical, right? There were things that were affecting the ability for me to do medical care in North Korea. So I did a master's in public health. I did a fellowship in global health. And then Harvard Medical School asked me when I finished, can you stay as faculty at the medical school in the global health department in the global surgery program? So I said, well, you kicked me out. You should check your records. So I told them about what happened. They said, that's not a problem. So I was, so I've been a member of the faculty ever since. And so here, that's my journey to what I would consider a leadership position, right? So I do have some messages for the students. One message really has to do with really try to kindle that spirit of empathy. What does that mean for you? When there's something wrong and you feel like there's a sense of injustice, grab onto that thought, right? Because that's a part of you that really is something that's important, because I'm not doing what I'm doing to get a degree or get a recognition or get some kind of award. My only intent is to serve others. And as I keep serving others, I keep getting placed in positions of more and more influence. So my first motivation is really service, then the leadership positions follow as a result. So if you try to make leadership position as your primary objective, I guarantee you it's not that for me it didn't work, and you'll be dissatisfied, I think. And generally speaking, people in these leadership positions will recognize that pretty quickly as someone who's self-serving and self-promoting, and you won't get those positions. So I think it's important to look about, when you feel like something is wrong, and it's a social injustice, whether it has to do with Asian racism or even any kind of racism, or exploitation of the vulnerable, or things like what's happening in Korea, right? So right now there's a big push for an end of war declaration on the Korean Peninsula, right? And it's being led from two different directions. One is it's a priority for the South Korean government. President Moon Jae-in has talked about it for a couple of years, and now he's making it into a very big foreign policy initiative. That's why the Vice Minister Che was in Washington involved in a trilateral meeting with Wendy Sherman, his counterpart in the U.S. State Department, and the Japanese actually were there as well. So there's that South Korean-led diplomatic effort, plus the Korean Americans here in the U.S. are no longer remaining silent. So Casey Choi, some of you know him, right, from Los Angeles. He's been incredibly effective in convincing some members of Congress, Brad Sherman being one of them, in introducing resolutions at the U.S. Congress, looking specifically at achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. And every week, it seems like he's getting more and more sponsors on this resolution. And we support that. Then there's that sort of a first generation Korean American community that's pushing for end of war declaration. And then I consider myself more of a second generation. Myself, Christine An, and then Jessica Lee from Quincy Institute, the three of us led an open letter campaign with 70 signatures from prominent Korean Americans who I can tell you 5 years from now would have never signed on to this letter. They would have looked at it and says, "Oh, it's too sensitive." But you know what? The tide is changing, and we had this open letter. We sent it to President Biden in March, and we keep pushing, keeping pressure on the U.S. government, our lawmakers, our representatives, and saying we want an end of war declaration. So the Koreans want this. Koreans want. I want it. Why don't we want peace? Right? So this is something where I think the diaspora could make a huge difference. Right? This is really a U.S. is the main hurdle, but it wouldn't hurt to have Koreans in Germany or Koreans in France or Brazil speak out to their lawmakers and say, this is something you should tell the U.S. or make a public position on that. So, it's all about trying to be of service. And so that's a point that I want to make. And then I want to have a word of caution. Word of caution. There's a phenomena where I think we get so focused on the service work that the ends justify the means. And I think Koreans are maybe overdoing in some way. So they try to help others, but then in the process, they might bend the rules, or they might even step on other people on the way there. And I can tell you from my personal experience, we've had two incidents that happened over the last 5 years where students bent the rules and got in trouble, or they did things they were using other people to get what they wanted, just unethical things. They were both Korean American students. So you have to wonder if this is a pattern or not. But I just say that it's never okay to bend the rules, right? Just to justify the means. And I think we have this culture of let's get there no matter what, right? hyper-competitive environment. No, you can get to where you want to go by being a good person, by being honest, and by being sincere. We should be teaching our children, next generation, do it right, play by the rules. And it's just embarrassing to me to see both students be of Korean American descent. So I will close with this one line, and I try to find out who said it. I just try to Google it, but I couldn't find it. But it's a very great quote. If you know who it is, let me know. And it says, "Never whisper in face of injustice." And I love that because, we start saying, you know when something's not right, and you start whispering. No, speak out loud. Make yourself heard. Do not hold back, right, in face of injustice. And you just never know where that might lead you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. We're going to break for a few minutes, and as a reminder, we're going to head into our Q&A session. And so I'm sure over the course of our program, our speakers have lots of thought-provoking things. So our program director, Christine Lee, is going to walk around and collect questions from you all, and then we'll head into our panel in about 5 minutes. and how do you stay motivated?
I guess since I am holding the mic, I could go first. I think community. I think when you're grounded in community and the people who love you, and the people who remind you who you are every day, I think that's important. As Dr. Kee was saying that, it's easy to maybe lose sight of, what's important and like the empathy, right? The people who remind you that you're human and the people who feed you. I think that gives me the confidence because I think if my community has my back, then I have theirs. And that's how I kind of move with confidence because honestly, I think in this world, there's so many narratives and so many scripts that we are told to do. Our life script is expected, right? And I think having people who always know you and when you're lost and you're confused and you feel scared and people who actually hold you in your fear and they're not telling you what to do, they're just saying like, let's exist in this together. I think that always gives me the confidence whenever I move forward in life.
Does anyone else want to chime in?
Rather than sharing my own wisdom, I want to share a line that has really moved me. I heard this line from a philosopher in Korea by the name of Choi, and he said this. He said, "The only moment you exist in this world is when you question. Because when you answer, you're basically regurgitating the accumulated knowledge that you happen to know. But it's when you question that you exist. Right? The reason I'm saying that is because what allows you to go against the grain is when you're curious about things. Right? And, you don't just abide by the standard, the norm that's set by others, but you're curious about yourself and the world, and I think that curiosity, interest in the world, I think, allows you to take a step further and go a different path.
As Ted Lasso says, if we have any Ted Lasso fans, be curious, not judgmental.
That's a great question. What gives me the confidence, right, to go against the grain? For one thing, knowing that you're motivated by a sense of justice, and then you're rooting for the underdogs. It's biblical for me, and it's the right thing to do. The people, who's going to speak for the voiceless, who's going to speak for the helpless and the oppressed? It's the right thing to do. And so when you try to help, you can't fail because any kind of help is good. So I always tell my daughters, you only fail when you fail to try. So that it gives me that confidence. And the other part of that is that you need a circle of people that will support you. I have my wife, she's over here, Susan. By the way, she should be next year's speaker because she's a leader in her own right. She's a Brookline town meeting member and a badass town meeting member. Yeah, she's a community organizer on steroids. But no, the point is, I have my wife. She's got my back. I mean, when I decided to leave private practice, it's a big decision, and she was all in. When I said, let's go to Cambodia, she's like, really? But she followed me there. So you need, and then your close family and a group of friends that you trust will support you.
I guess while Dr. Park, you have the mic, a specific question for you is, why do you think there was such a scarce number of Koreans helping North Korea when you first got involved?
Wow, great question. I think a lot of it is politics. So I grew up in South Korea during 1970s, 60s and 70s. North Koreans were like described as people with horns. Remember that? There was just so much propaganda, and then it works. it makes people distrust the regime and the people, and then put them all into one unit. So that, I think that has a lot to do with it. The way the negative propaganda that created this image that we shouldn't help. I still have issues within the Korean American Medical Association. You would think doctors would be 100% behind helping North Korean people, but they're actually Korean Americans who say, "Why are we helping North Korea?" And so this is something we still have to fight every day.
On the topic of raising awareness about discrimination, this is a question for Thu. Do you think educating students is a way for raising awareness of the discrimination that immigrants face in America? And maybe based on your own experience, what are ways that you have found that are successful to educate your community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to educate our communities, and actually after the summer of last year and the rise of anti-Asian hate throughout the nation and globally, I created an Asian American Social Justice Leadership Program at my organization. And it was one of the first in the nation that was having our young folks dive into this and them learning their history. I was just talking to Joseph earlier, how sometimes it feels like radical Asians or Asians who are looking into our history of resiliency, we feel so alone in this. And I think our young folks are starting to realize they could build community if they start talking about it. When anti-Asian hate was happening and they were worried about their parents, right? They were worried that when they go to a grocery store, is their parents going to be attacked? Or even in Atlanta, with the murders that happened there with the women, I feel like young folks were so scared and they didn't know how to take care of their community. They just didn't know. Some of them didn't know how to talk to their parents. I was saying how in Vietnamese it's really hard to talk about oppression and anti-discrimination, especially with the complexities of racism and all that, and also to talk to our elders about how they sometimes hurt us too, right? Sometimes our elders have traditional sexism and all these things that we actually have to heal together with our elders to do intergenerational work. And so I think young folks actually hold that. I think a lot of young folks with building empathy and care, they want to talk to their parents. And oftentimes I tell young people, especially ones who can't vote, wanted to vote for me but couldn't, that you are influencers in your life and in your society. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you don't have, the power to affect change. And I think it starts with education and creating a space for them to have these heart-to-heart conversations and that they feel safe. Once again, I think safety is so important, and that they could actually help us build together.
That's great. And kind of similarly, the question for Joseph about, there was that clip you played from your documentary about how the center of diaspora is pain, right? Being away from your home country. And so this question is, how do people with a diasporatic identity end up, converting that pain to innovation? Maybe you can speak about also the way that you kind of made the transition from being a lawyer to documentary filmmaking.
From pain to innovation, yeah. If anyone asks me if I can summarize Geronimo in one sentence, I think I would often quote that line from the Jewish Reform rabbi who's in New York synagogue. And that's what he said about the definition of diaspora. Is the diaspora is it starts from pain of ancestors having to leave their homeland, the pain of having to settle into a new home and facing of biases and discrimination and whatnot. But what the pain begets is the sense of innovation. Meaning, I think the future generation, as a result of their hybrid identities, as a result of their two cultures colliding and creating new sets of sort of fusion identities, I think that allows the kind of creativity and innovation that that both worlds aren't too familiar. It only gets beget by those who have experienced both worlds. But here's the thing, I mean, this is honest talk, but I feel the diasporic identity has never been taught, right? I think for two reasons, especially within the Korean American community, is because first, our migration history is relatively short, right? We're pretty much insular dynasty until the Japanese invasion and the Korean War, and that's when Koreans started to flee. And their number one priority when the first generation immigrants settled, no matter wherever in the world, they didn't have the mental bandwidth to teach what their children about their hybrid multi-identity is going to be. So no one was really aware of the possibility of this diasporic identity until recently, right? What's funny about the Koreans in Cuba is that they're now down to 7th generation, right? And starting from the 4th generation, 100% of Korean Cubans are so-called mixed blood, right? There's not a pure blood as a single Korean. And they've almost completely forgotten their Korean identity aside until BTS came along. And also because of Peronimo. No, I mean, I'm not talking about my movie, I'm talking about the main character, because he put a lot of work into reviving the Korean community. But so it's a new concept relatively, and I think it needs to be internalized within ourselves and also be taught to our children that there is something more than just the local identity or the homeland identity, but there can be a diasporic identity. Me going from law to film was the easy choice because everyone has different values and priorities. A lot of people's priorities and values are stability and career and success. But for me, it was finding identity, and once you identified by going to Cuba and meeting those Koreans, that wow, like I can learn about my identity through these people. Like everything else became irrelevant. So that switch was relatively easy.
I guess, Dr. Park, do you have any advice for students who may be looking to, pursue the things that actually matter to them, like find that empathy and the things that they care about, maybe go against what they're very pressured to do?
Yeah, I'm not going to tell people how to parent. But I will, let me say this. So Korean American students, generally speaking, when I see all the students that come up to me, or contact me out of the blue, it's a very small number. Non-Korean American students, and I mean that, I'm not just saying white students. There are other ethnic groups that are very aggressive, but they self-advocate, right? They will contact you and say, hey, I'm a third-year student majoring in this. I heard you talk, and I'd love to set up a time to meet with you or have a call with you because I'm really interested in what you're doing. I just don't. So I think Korean American students it's a very practical advice. Self-advocating. Listen, the worst thing they can say is no, right? But what can happen is they'll say sure, So just a little pro tip: faculty at Harvard, at least, they get asked about how many students they mentor, right? So they have a professional incentive to mentor as many students as they can. Typically, they divide it into Harvard students and not Harvard students, but still, it's something that they have to be able to say that they're doing. So there's that, but there's a general shift towards a mentorship as something that we do as faculty, and actually I enjoy it. I enjoy seeing my mentees. I just met somebody here saying, "Oh, I know a doctor in Dallas who's working in North Korea. Turns out she's one of my mentees." So you can get this satisfaction. But self-advocating, I think, would be a really something that I would try to encourage Korean American students to do.
We have a question from our live stream for Joseph. As growing up Korean American, I've seen the glass ceiling for Asian Americans be in mid-management, but not in upper management. especially personally, I've encountered many companies where Asian Americans didn't get too advanced in upper management, although this has improved somewhat in the US. Do you see this being the same in other countries, I guess based on your travels?
It's a very difficult question because it's hard to generalize, right? But I think it has a lot to do with the political system of whichever country that the questioner is asking. For instance, China, no, because Korean ethnic Chinese people cannot occupy high ranks in the government just by virtue of them being an ethnic minority. So it's a systematic issue. Whereas like Koreans in Brazil, as far as I've seen, is yeah, you can climb up the ladder if you like to, if you can. But what ends up happening oftentimes is a lot of second generation Korean Brazilians end up taking over their parents' businesses because of the political and economic turmoil of the country in general. So even if they become doctors or lawyers, the just general pay is way lower than how much you would make as running a textile business that your parents run, right? So there's a lot of the career switches in midway through their career. So it's not a political issue, but it's like a societal issue. I think Korean Russians, there's quite a few Koreans, making into the mainstream, as well as Germany. I think there's a first Korean German congressman that was just elected this year. So they're making strides in other places, but it depends on the political system of the country.
I was telling President Yeung earlier that I think there's so much unexpected overlap between all three of your presentations that I'm really grateful for. So this question was originally for Joseph, but I think all three of you could answer it. Does the progression from Korean American to Korean American diaspora and world member reduce one's individualism? And this isn't just Korean American, but I think the question is, when we think about diaspora, does it reduce one's individuality?
Yes, can I start? I think any generalization, any categorization contains within it the risk of reducing the vast possibility of what it can mean. So there's always a danger to try to generalize any concept or identity. So that should have been cautioned, and that's my fault for not mentioning it. But ultimately, this is how I see identity, right? I don't think anyone has to necessarily find their identity if they don't wish to. I don't think it should be forced upon them, right? In a way, I asked the Buddhist monk, why is seeking identity important? He compared that to like reaching nirvana, or like as a Christian, like being born again or finding your own God. That's what he said. I mean, like identity for some people gives you that sense of gratification and empowerment by realizing your fullest potential and your other sides of identity. But so is religion, right? Some people choose not to take it, and some people can choose it if they like it. So it's a tricky thing, but I don't think it should be ever enforced. But it should be a self journey, and everyone has a different journey on their own.
I found it interesting because I'm also a writer, and one of the things I love about the word diaspora is just how beautiful it sounds, like diaspora. It makes me feel like I'm not. It makes me feel like I'm not lost, right? Like I feel like I have a place in the world without a place at the same time, and I think there's this beautiful complexity of holding that. And I think it is a personal journey, and it does take a little bit of time to really getting used to. But for me, it feels really hopeful. And I think what I love about Joseph's presentation was, what about how do we hold that and also hold us as global citizens, right? And as I mentioned with like the Asian American Social Justice Leadership Program, it was about us as not only Vietnamese folks in diaspora, but how do we learn about other people's diasporas? and how there's similarities and differences, and that we can hold all the worlds and build something better.
I also love the way you ask those things.
As a medical person, I think it sounds a lot like diarrhea. So seriously. Yeah. So seriously, that's a great question, right? Because we start dividing ourselves based on our identity. So as a person, in the US, I'm an American technically, right? But I'm also a surgeon. Now, being a surgeon doesn't take away anything by the fact that I'm also an American citizen, and vice versa. But when it comes to ethnic identities, I think we tend to say we're not 100% this, we're not 100% that. And I want to say that we need to stop doing that. We are all here, maybe exception of, Consul General and his wife. We're Americans. We're 100% Americans. Don't forget that. We have a right to be here. We deserve all the rights and benefits of American citizens. Right? At the same time, we're 100% Vietnamese, 100% Korean culture. We have that. We celebrate that, right? Why should we decrease any of that? And then we're also identified as Korean diaspora and world citizens. It's like a candle. You light another candle, you have two candles. You don't divide the flame into two. So, everybody's a world citizen and a human being. There's two candles right there anyway. And then you add on to these candles. You don't ever reduce yourself.
On that note, I think our Q&A is, the candle has dimmed. But we would like to invite everyone to the front of the room for our group photo before we head into our raffle. So if everyone could just make their way to the front, we're gonna space some chairs out here and we'll just kind of get into a formation.
Ryan, can you move this a little bit? One moment. Let me close
We bring chairs. Yeah. Turning the, oh, are you turning the projector?
I'm gonna turn the live stream on.
Okay, that's fine.